Why does Texas continue to see winter peak demand spike so sharply during cold weather, even years after Winter Storm Uri put winter reliability front and center? Welcome back to the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm Matt Boms, and today we have a really special guest and someone I've been excited to talk with for a very long time. Joining me is Kurt Heim. Kurt is Vice President of Environmental Advancement and Texas Government Affairs at Daikin Comfort Technologies, one of the world's largest manufacturers of high-efficiency heating and cooling systems. Kurt has spent more than 2 decades in the HVAC industry, including leading the development of Daikin's massive manufacturing facility in Waller, Texas, one of the largest HVAC plants in the world. He works at the intersection of technology, manufacturing, policy, and grid reliability, and he is exactly the right person to help us talk about how heat pumps can lower bills, strengthen the Texas grid, and help us stop panicking every time winter shows up. So Kurt, you're the star today. Welcome to the show, and thanks so much for your time.
Matt, thank you very much for having me. I'm a longtime listener of the podcast, and I'm really excited about the direction that you're going in, and just really pleased to be here and get a chance to talk about heat pumps.
Thanks so much, Kurt. I appreciate that. So I want to kick us off. We're coming off of this winter storm Fern, and it feels like this anxiety cycle that we go through in Texas. You can trace this all the way back to Uri, and understandably, Texans get nervous when they hear a winter storm is coming. We had a few since then. We had Winter Storm Heather that hit. Now we have Fern. And I think just to tee this up, why do we still feel like the grid is on knife's edge every time it gets cold in Texas?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. I am probably going to say that really Uri was a shared experience and a searing event that touched a lot of people. I don't know anybody that didn't have some level of disruption in their life. Mild forms of it would have been that you lost your power for a few days, but a lot of people had severe issues. My neighbor was one of them that lost power, but then had pipes burst in his ceiling in his attic, and so he had a major, rehabilitation of his house. So those things really make an impression in your mind, and we watched it happen in front of us, and there were a lot of scary things that were talked about at the time, like, would we lose the grid? Would it lose functionality? And that was something that I think sticks in our mind going forward. So I think that's why we still have some anxiety around it. I think for me, I try to use the anxiety to my benefit. Like, hey, let's prepare for it. Let's get things in line to do it so that you can personally be more resilient. But I think that's where it comes from, Matt. We just all had that very, very visceral experience with Uri.
Yeah, it's definitely a shared experience. And I know that the media pays a lot of attention now when a winter storm comes. And the question that I get asked the most is, will the grid survive this winter storm? And luckily, we did make it through the last one, right? But I want to really pick your brain on what the root of the problem is here, right? Does Texas have a winter grid problem? And what can we do to solve it?
Yeah, I think you're putting a fine point on it. We'll talk a little bit about technology and heating technology specifically as one of the, I guess you could call it, vulnerabilities that we have. But, what these events really teach us is that we can put a button on some of the things that we need to change and do. And so, out of Uri, there was a lot of attention paid to weatherization. And I think that the legislature has done a lot of good work. And then the PUC and ERCOT have done, a lot with that too. We may have that largely behind us, but then we're also exposing these other rocks. And one of them is around heating technology. We'll talk a lot today about electric resistance heating, and that is a form of heating that is extremely wasteful. It's an old technology that we still have on our grid, but we have it at scale. And so that's the concern really that we're driving forward, and one that we really need to keep in front of us, and one that we can solve. As if we're talking about the energy discussions, one of the nice things about where we are today is that it's more of an all of the above discussion. And I truly sense that when I'm talking to people about it. And so finding places to understand where we have opportunities, where we have levers, where we have things that we can change that are not, terribly expensive, but they need to be addressed is really where we are. And so I think, winter grid problem, I think we have an electric resistance heating issue that we need to solve. And that's one that, we'll probably talk about some of the stats in this discussion, but it's not insignificant. And I think that it fits a lot with where Texas wants to go. We probably want to use that power that we could save by changing heating technology to do other more value added things that will help the state prosper. So that's really what I think we have is a heating problem, heating technology problem.
Yeah, well said. And help us understand what that means, Kurt. So, when you say resistance heating, for someone listening to this podcast and maybe they're in a house or an apartment and they have resistance heating, what does that look like? And how could that person look at alternatives, right? Like, walk us through why so much construction in Texas is already built with resistance heating versus more advanced technologies.
Oh, yeah, this is a good place to start. So, an electric resistance heater is basically what you see in your toaster. What you do is you run electric current through resistive wires, and those wires heat up and they glow. And so then if you push air across that, now you're heating with electric resistance heating. And they're called a lot of different things like electric furnaces, for example. But what it is it's one unit of electricity produces one unit of heating energy. And so it requires a lot of electricity to generate a lot of heat so that you can heat a dwelling. A couple examples of where that is. If you were in a single family home and that home was about, let's say, 2,000 square feet, you might have 10,000 watts of electric resistance heating, if that's how you're heating it. So 10 kW. If you're in an apartment, like a one bedroom apartment in Houston, Texas, you might have five. So that's a lot of energy that you're using. Now you're not heating. We don't have the most severe winters, but really that starts to kick in around, where your set point is. So if you keep your thermostat at about 68 degrees, you're going to start seeing that electric resistance heater come on at that point. Now, it operates a little bit different than other technologies, but that is the most basic heating technology I think that's out there other than like a gas furnace. And I think one of the reasons why we see it quite a bit is if you look at multifamily, a lot of multifamily is all electric. So in all electric areas, you really don't have a lot of options for other fuels. So that's why you see there. But at its core, it's a hot wire that you blow air across.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I want to hear more about heat pumps from you because you're such an expert on this. And I think there's a myth out there that heat pumps don't work in the cold. So, can you take us through this and just explain in simple terms what a heat pump does and why it's so much more efficient than resistance heating?
Yeah, completely. I think you're right. I think there is some misperceptions out there, and it may stem from really what a modern heat pump is to maybe what a heat pump might have been and how it works. And really and truly, most of the time, you're not going to know the difference between an air conditioner and a heat pump because the technology is held in the outdoor unit. And so, what it is at its core is an air conditioner that can run backwards and it doesn't create heat, it moves heat. So even 0 degrees Fahrenheit or at freezing, there's a lot of heat in the atmosphere. And when the refrigerant cycle runs backwards, it collects that heat from outside and it moves it inside. So the parts of your air conditioner in the summer that get cold, that you blow air across, get warm. And you blow that warm air around your dwelling and you get heat from it. So because it doesn't have to create the heat, it moves the heat and it uses the refrigerant cycle to do that. It can do it up to 4 times more efficient than the electric resistance heat. So think about it that way. It's an air conditioner with a few different technology differences that allow it to run backwards and then collect that heat, which we know the sun's renewing that heat all the time. But even at those low temperatures, there is heat there to gather and move into your house to provide that more efficient heating.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Kurt. And you mentioned the history, and I think it actually is worth diving in a little bit and unpacking that, because that's the great thing about a podcast is we have time to talk, and the long form conversation, I think, lends into getting into the weeds a little bit on this. So help me unpack how far heat pumps have come over the past few decades here. And maybe that's where some of the misperceptions are as far as how efficient or how effective heat pumps can be in cold weather.
Yeah, I think, using kind of Houston or most of our state is in 2 different climate zones, climate zone 2 and 3. So, if you think of it this way, Houston's in 2, Dallas is in 3. So, you get that kind of differential, and that's where most of the population is kind of, above I-20, around I-20, between I-20 and I-10, and then south of I-10. But in those particular climates, we don't have severe winters, right? We'll have an occasional winter storm. But one of the areas that heat pumps have improved over the years is in their capacity, their ability to deliver and gather more heat and move more heat at lower ambient temperatures. And so, one of the things that I think contributed to some hesitation about using heat pumps in the past is that capacity would, you start to run out of capacity at higher ambient temperatures. So if your heat pump wasn't working well around 30 degrees and you need to design for 30 degrees, then you got to look at some other technologies. But as things have evolved, compression technology, refrigerants, and things of that nature have improved, it's improved the efficiency and capacity of that. And so now you see them operate very well in our climate zone. And I think, part of what I think, want to talk about as well is the future. So one of the things that Daikin has as a core technology is variable speed. So a lot of what we'll talk about in basic heat pumps is a single speed technology, which is really like your air conditioner, it turns on, it turns off. But variable speed will actually modulate or adjust with the need of heating and cooling that is required. So what's exciting about where the technology is going, it's starting to move more into variable speed. And variable speed actually offers even more heat delivery at lower temperatures. So even, as low as -5, you're going to have some variable speed heat pumps that are going to perform very well. For reference, that -5 is probably mostly out of the design standards for, Texas. Maybe you might get into some of that in the panhandle, but some of those variable speed will require no heating backup at all. So a lot of heat pumps will have a backup electric heater, kind of the one that we talked about before, will work the same way. That if you are starting to get into a temperature where the capacity is going down, you're not left without heat. It's going to work in conjunction with that heater to deliver. But the promise that we really see of variable speed is being able to go to a lot lower ambient temperature with very little, if any, requirement for electric resistance heating. And another exciting thing just to kind of put out there for variable speed, 'cause I know you guys have done a lot of work on, what needs to be on the grid. How can we actually create value with our consumption, so to speak? Variable speed offers a lot of promise for being responsive to grid conditions and because of the efficiency that it delivers. But the fact that, if you needed to do a demand response in today's world, you got to turn your system off, basically, either move your set point to where it's off or physically turn the system off. Variable speed could just go down to like, well, we're operating at 80% speed. We'll go to 75% or we'll go to 65% speed and really still have a lot of comfort. I say comfort. If some people really it's a health issue, they need to have a pretty moderate climate in their home. They need a certain amount of heat, a certain amount of cool. But you may be able to achieve that with variable speed and not really have to turn anything off. So that's really kind of going from, the past where the capacities weren't as good as they are now, improvements in refrigerant compression technology and heat exchange, bringing it to the future. Now variable speed is factoring into it and even getting to a place where backup heating isn't really required in a lot of climates with those variable speed systems.
Yeah, that's a game changer. And it sounds like what I take away from that is Texas is uniquely suited for heat pumps, right? Like, I think some people think of heat pumps as, a great solution in a place like New England or the Midwest. But what I'm hearing from you is actually we're uniquely positioned in Texas to benefit from heat pumps because of the climate that we have down here. And I think what I wanted to know, Kurt, also is when you were talking about resistance heating, you said you talked about that 1 to 1, right? 1 unit of electricity yields 1 unit of heat. What does that look like on the heat pump side?
It's more like 2 to 4 times. So that's where the efficiency's gained really and not having to use the energy to create the heat, but actually just use it to move around. So it can have what's called the coefficient of performance. So electric resistance heat has a 1 on your scale, and heat pumps are gonna be anywhere up to 4. So that's where you're really driving a lot of efficiency. Let's put that in perspective, and I'll use for a point of reference a project that we did in Houston's Fifth Ward in an apartment complex where we took about 25% of the HVAC systems that were electric resistance heat and we converted them to heat pumps. And nothing else was done to the dwelling, no added insulation, no windows and door ceilings, nothing of that, just technology A and replace it with technology B. In those particular instances, we've seen about a 50% reduction in the demand for energy in order to heat those dwellings. So those went in December of 2024. So we caught a really cold February in 2025. And now we'll catch the data from this past winter storm as we're kind of sitting here recording it. We're on the last day, I guess, of the winter storm that we had in January 2026. So we'll catch some of that data and it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, those are delivering about 50% reduction in demand.
That's so wild because your baseline is cutting energy costs in half, basically, for folks who have heat pumps installed. And I want to jump into that and talk about the economics because Texans are very savvy when it comes to energy use, right? And we'll jump into that in just a second. But I didn't want to skip over the grid level conversation and how much of a difference this could make during a winter storm event, right? Because we have a winter problem in Texas. There was a Texas A&M study that came out last year that talked about resistance heating. Over 2.7 million homes in Texas still use electric resistance heat. They can each pull about 9 kilowatts of, during a cold snap like we saw last weekend. And if you add that all up, that's 12 gigawatts of winter demand, equivalent to 40 large power plants, right? So are we essentially looking at millions of homes turning into giant space heaters at the same time? Is that really what we're doing in Texas, the way that we built our homes and apartment buildings?
Sometimes I look at it that way. Sometimes I'll drive around and I'll see a new apartment complex going up, and I think about each one of those with a 5 kW heater or maybe a bigger apartment with an 8 kW heater in it. And we know that that's happening. We've done our own research in the market, and we know that about 85% of the apartments that you see, if we just talk about multifamily as a big cohort, about 85% of those are going in with electric resistance heaters. So, and they're going in at scale. And when you think about that, the life of that equipment could be 15 years. So you're 15 years away from an end of life technology change where you have the opportunity to make a different decision, not necessarily that you are going to, but you're about 15 years away from that. And so the Texas A&M study and the ACEEE study really put a bright light on the potential that we have in changing out that technology and what that could go towards. You hit it on the head. About almost 3 million homes. I think a big percentage of those are apartments, and I think a big percentage of those are all electric apartments, but that's a big number, 9 kW per, using that to heat, you know, that starts to help you reason around why we had a winter peak that was over 80 gigawatts. That's like an August number, right? And so you start to see that at scale, and it is something that really needs to be addressed and thought through. We'll probably talk about it. There are some levers to get there, but really that you framed up the problem right there. There's a lot of waste there, but I think in our state, one of the good things about it is that, you could reframe where that energy could go, and that energy could go to adding industry and jobs and prosperity. But we've got to draw big distinctions in how we go after it and really divvy up the problem and find these little pockets and areas of opportunity and go after them.
Absolutely. And now that Texas is ushering in this new age of data centers and AI, and we've seen some load forecasting over at ERCOT that sees us doubling our peak demand in the next 5 or 6 years, right? So, considering those numbers, you've got 12 gigawatts on the table right now in the form of resistance heating, right? So, you would think that the easiest and quickest solution would be, picking that low hanging fruit and saying that's something we could take care of tomorrow, right? That's just an easy solution that's sitting on the table. And it could at least, at a very minimum, avoid the anxiety that we all go through every wintertime when there's a storm and we're sitting around wondering if the grid will survive.
I think going after it makes a lot of sense. What it would do is pay some really good dividends around affordability. So if we need to add that capacity like you're talking about, what we're really talking about is increasing the fixed cost of our energy bill, right? There's a lot that needs to go into that. Now, there will be users of all that load, but if we can find ways to more fully use the capacity that we have, we can hold down the costs, and the costs are going to be very important. There's a lot of good research by TEPRI that really gets into how energy vulnerable people are and the things that they go through with their own curtailment and discomfort. In the summer, they're too hot, in the winter, they're too cold, and they're trying to save. And really, we can find these areas and eliminate this waste and help hold those costs down. We are gonna grow, and that's gonna happen, but I think one of the things that sticks in my mind is at the Texas Energy Summit, Doug Lewin gave kind of a really nice TED Talk kinda thought discussion, and he talked about utilization of the existing infrastructure that we have, and higher percentages of utilization are really what we need to strive for. We need to flatten the peaks so that we can get more utilization, because there we're using the assets that we already have. And so that actually can start to make an argument that it could lower costs over time. So really that's got to be part of the focus, is getting to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And let's get into the economics here, Kurt. And you mentioned the AAC study, and we'll share the study in the notes. Can you walk us through the economics here at, just the household level? And there's, I think, a common misperception that heat pumps are so expensive that they don't make economic sense, right? So help us understand the real economics here. What's the return on investment, right? How long will it take me to recover those upfront costs?
Yeah, really, when we think about this, let's go back to the kind of the original discussion that we had where, what does a basic single speed heat pump look like? It looks like your air conditioner outside. So that's kind of the starting point. And what does it have that's different than that air conditioner outside? It's got, a few modifications to it. It's got something called a reversing valve, and then it's got a little bit of a different control board. When you're talking about the added costs of that, you're talking about a few $100s between, the sunk cost of buying a basic air conditioner and then the amount of additional spend and cost that you have to buy a basic heat pump. So a few $100 in that. In that ACEEE study, it looked at a couple different ways that you would get into a heat pump. There's a little bit more expense for retrofitting. So let's say $700-800 or less on average is what they found. Though I think those are probably pretty good figures. But the savings could be substantial, and it could be as high as, close to $400 a year. So you're looking at 1 to 2 year paybacks for the ratepayer on that. They also looked at new construction. New construction is the cheapest way to put in a heat pump. You've got a lot of things at your advantage in that, in the procurement, because you're buying at scale probably. If you're a builder and you're putting in a neighborhood, you're not buying one system, you're buying, dozens, if not hundreds of systems. So there's some benefit there. And then lower cost if it's designed in as a basis of design. And so, we took that $700-800 retrofit example. ACEEE thought that that would come down by about half. So what would that give you? That would give you like a 1 year payback, right, on that for the people that go in that direction and the people that use a heat pump. So those are the economics. I think if you start to roll that into annual, if we started today and we started working through getting more and more systems retrofitted, and then in construction, if we started, having a higher percentage of them go in with heat pumps that would have been electric resistance furnaces, then you could start to see in the $1 billion range per year after a few years in bill savings. And so there's, some calculations on that. What are the costs going to be per kilowatt hour? But right now we're expecting those to probably go up 30% over the next, period of time before 2030. And I don't think that's a crazy thing to think about. So those improvements and paybacks are even going to go up. So in the example that we're giving, it's really, you're the homeowner. This is something that you should really take a hard look at. You're the ratepayer as well. So you're making the decision in that. But also we talk about the multifamily piece of it. That's where there's some need for some economic alignment around incentives, because the landlord or the builder or the developer has one set of incentives that are different from the ratepayer. The ratepayer doesn't get to participate in the choice of the heating technology. So they can, be the recipient of a higher bill due to that technology.
Yeah, you teed up my next question perfectly because in listening to you, it's such a no-brainer, right? Like, why wouldn't you do this if you're saying that for new construction, essentially you're getting 100% ROI, right, on that initial investment of the heat pump. And then for retrofits, you're making your money back in the initial 1 or 2 years. So the fundamental question in my mind is, well, why haven't we fixed this already? Like, what are the main obstacles here? Because it just sounds like a no-brainer, Kurt. It sounds like we should all have heat pumps up and running in our homes and businesses.
Yeah, this is a question that vexes me quite a bit. Why can't we get there? I think we've got a lot of tools to help us get there. Sometimes it's a little frustrating because those tools are, like incentives and rebates, et cetera, will pay for the switch back, switched from electric to heat pump. But what is making you make the right decision out of the gate, right? How do we get there? And so, really, I think it comes down to education, because if somebody's designing, we'll use the apartment as an example. They're designing an apartment, there's a basis of design. If that basis of design is the code minimum, which is really what probably it is or heavily influences it, then you're going to get the cheapest alternative, the least expensive capital outlay to get there. And that's going to be an electric resistance heat, an electric furnace. And why is that okay? Because you're not the ratepayer, right? You're putting capital into the system, but you're not actually paying the operating costs of it. So I think basis of design is something that we have to really look at, which goes back to the energy codes. And so really happy that the state is, through a process, in the midst of a process of updating those to a 2024 standard. But when you peel back the onion on that 2024 standard, it doesn't deal with electric resistance heating the way it needs to. It has a lot of restrictions on electric resistance heating for climate zones 4 and above. But if you remember earlier in the podcast, we talked about most of our state's population is in climate zone 2 and 3, and it doesn't address climate zone 2 and 3. That's something that we're hoping that the State Energy Conservation Office and Texas A&M, who's doing the evaluation, will take a very hard look at, because if they can understand how to make that code work better for the population in the state, then we're going to get a basis of design that is going to be more restrictive of heat pumps. And then we'll start to see the market change on that. But you asked a very good question. And I think for me today, as I sit here, we study this problem quite a bit. It really comes down to a lot of a basis of design.
Yeah, it sounds like a combination of inertia, maybe lack of awareness, and just business as usual, right? Just
Yeah.
we've always built this way, and this is how we'll continue to build instead of looking at more advanced technology that really could save hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for folks that are actually living in these homes, right? It's a huge opportunity. I mean, this is every time we have these winter storms in Texas, it's heartbreaking when you see the bills that folks have to pay because they just have old resistance heating and their homes can't keep up with these temperatures that dip into the teens. And if, God forbid, we end up in single digit temperatures, that could be a grid crisis, right? Just because of resistance heating.
Yeah, you really put a good visual on it. I would say one other thing contributes to it, and business as usual, I think is good, but we're almost a victim of our own success. Like the rates, the kilowatt hour rate in the state is low relative to a lot of other parts of the country. That's why we're seeing a lot of load growth come to the state, and the potential is even more. So there's a lot that the state has exactly right, which attracts it to it. We just have a few of these tweaks that we need to go after in order to really shore things up. But, I would add to that just kind of a victim of our own success.
Yeah, absolutely. And for someone who's living in a multifamily apartment building, that person might not feel like energy is affordable because of how much energy they're forced to consume, right? Because they've got resistance heating and the kilowatt hour might not be expensive, but if you add up all the kilowatt hours, it certainly is a lot of money that they're paying at the end of the month.
Yeah, you could, you kind of set this up in a nice way to think about it from a cost perspective. The human part of it is really hard. People are dealing with a lot, but you could see somebody with a winter storm bill, like if we had an extended cold snap, they're using 5 kWs to heat that one bedroom apartment. To cool it in August, they're probably using half of that for the compressor to run, right? And so that compressor in a heat pump is gonna deliver the same heating that you're gonna get out of the summer, but it's gonna do it at a lower kilowatt per hour, and so they're not experiencing that, and so for them, they're not getting a break, and they have to adjust their behavior. I think in our 5th ward project, we've seen on average right at $100 in savings in the first winter that we had the units in. And I'm expecting that we'll see that again this winter, maybe even a little bit more because we didn't get them in until December of 2024. So we missed a little bit. It was a warmer winter, but 2025 was pretty cold for that. And then 2026 is starting off pretty cold too. So you think about the impact that somebody on a fixed income, $100, or we even saw one that was closer to $140. You spread that all across 2 or 3 months, that could really be a big impact to their budget.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I do want to focus here in the last bit of our conversation on what can be done to solve this problem, right? Like it's a hard nut to crack. We've already talked about the reasons why heat pumps aren't widely installed in Texas and why they should be installed in Texas. It's pretty much common sense for anyone who's made it this far into the podcast. So, what can we practically do about this problem, Kurt? Texas is a pro business state. We're not mandating anything anytime soon, but we do want a free competitive market that supports common sense technologies like heat pumps, right? So business as usual can't be acceptable anymore. And for decision makers in this state, they are certainly looking at this as the next logical solution for saving money for their constituents.
I think we've got to really engage more with policymakers and do a good job of educating on the issue. We had Chairman Anchia of Dallas introduced a bill, and Senator Boris Miles of Houston introduced it in the Senate in the last legislature, and we had a hearing on it. And the hearing started to really educate the lawmakers on, electric resistance heating and why the bill was actually asking them to prohibit it from being used as a primary heat source. So electric resistance heating under that bill could be a backup or supplemental heat, but you had to have a heat pump as the primary, which is kind of similar to the building code that we talked about that won't really impact our state. So now you're starting to see why, the legislative route made sense. We've got to educate more on the topic. We've got to really draw good examples, talk about the economics of it, talk about what you can do in terms of greater grid utilization. We have good programs out there for utilities. we've got to publicize those. I think of Daikin as an OEM, a manufacturer. We want to make sure that our customers are aware that there are options out there offered by the utilities to supplement or, provide rebates and incentives to change the technology, right? To transform that. So we have to educate more on all that and bring it forward. We also have to take a hard look at, some of our building standards. And then I think we have to look at the priorities that we need to make. I think that, if you take the ACEEE at 12 gigawatts or Texas A&M at almost 14 gigawatts that they think this is, there's a lot more higher value add that the state can bring to bear by spending those gigawatts on new business or expanding industry, et cetera. And we have to start to look at that paradigm. So educate on the value, educate on the ways that exist today to transform the market by way of incentives and rebates. We've got to continue to focus on contractor training. One of the things that we see is, who the expert is on HVAC when you're sitting in August in a 100-degree home. The contractor is really the expert that you rely on to help you make a technology selection. We've got to help them understand what they can offer in terms of different technologies. And then just public education. I think we have to raise the issue as much as we can. And I think all those things will contribute. We see really positive results when the legislature and the different policy agencies in the state are well informed on an issue. And it just looks like this is almost a no brainer, but it's one that you have to get out there and really advocate for and educate.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a great article that came out recently in the Houston Chronicle from Claire Howe talking about how this is the next logical step for Texas and meeting all of this load growth that's coming, right? And if you can bring in more market incentives for this technology, as an example, the utilities are responsible for upgrading our distribution grid in Texas, right? So they ultimately spend millions of dollars and recover those costs, and the ratepayers end up paying for the infrastructure. But there are cases where technology like heat pumps could step in and play a really important role in reducing the local load, right? Like we're talking about 12 gigawatts or even 14 gigawatts here. That's a significant chunk of our winter peak load, right? So if a utility can come in and say, look, we know we can solve part of this problem with heat pumps, then the state should take a serious look at that and actually allow utilities and different market players to come in and provide that solution for the customer. Because ultimately, we're all trying to help the customer here, right? Like we're all trying to make sure that we're lowering bills for customers and making energy more affordable. So I'm cautiously optimistic here listening to you, Kurt, because I feel like we do have the next steps that we need to take here as a state. I just hope there's enough political willpower to get it done.
Yeah, I agree with you. I would like to highlight something that really encourages me quite a bit. Utilities need tools or they need the PUC to kind of align with where they want to go. And one area that I can talk about as a success area is that we had a heat pump working group that was helping provide feedback on potential updates to the TRM, the technical reference manual, which is kind of like the rule book and the scorebook for how utilities work with incentives. And one of the things that we found was that the baseline, so anything you get benefit from, you have to exceed the baseline. But the baseline for new construction in multifamily actually assumed the heat pump was being put in. So you had to go to an Energy Star heat pump or a high efficiency heat pump in order to really qualify. The working group kind of provided some data and information to the PUC that say, hey, actually, we don't think that that's accurate. And they made a change and they lowered the baseline. So what that is going to allow is that, greater amount of incentive could be paid for somebody installing like a mid efficiency heat pump than before, where the baseline just assumed you had a heat pump in there anyway. This is one of the great things about this state, that we're really practical in how we operate. But when facts and figures and people align on it, you can see change. But that change is really going to be for utilities can offer that, but they have to offer a program. Somebody has to take you up on the program and then they have to, put in the system. And that's really for new construction. So it helps us stop digging the hole But really, the nearly 3 million homes that we talked about earlier are already out there. They're already built. The built environment is there. We need more to address that. But it's very encouraging that when you can bring all that together, you can actually see some change happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, Texas is obviously leading the country in a lot of different categories. It's a pro business state. I think that technology moves a lot quicker than the policy does sometimes, right? But no better company or business or case study than Daikin, one of the largest HVAC manufacturers based right here in Waller, Texas. So keep up the great work, Kurt. And I'm sure we'll have you back and we'll be hearing from you soon. I think this is just the easiest step that the state could take to meet all of its energy demand and lower bills for customers. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks for unpacking all of these complicated topics for us.
You bet, Matt. Really appreciate getting the opportunity to come in here and talk about heat pumps today and how we really think that they offer something that is a tremendous benefit to the state. So good luck to you and the rest of your podcast this year. And really, really glad to be a part of this one.
Perfect. Thanks, Kurt.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Energy Capital Podcast. If today's conversation helped you make sense of the energy world, share the episode with a friend and hit follow on your podcast app. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the usual platforms. For deeper analysis each week, subscribe to the Texas Energy Empower newsletter at texasenergyempower.com. That's where you'll find every episode, every article, and all of our latest updates. We're also on LinkedIn, X, and YouTube, where we post clips, insights, and ongoing commentary. Big thanks to Nate Peavy, our producer. I'm Matt Boms, and I'll see you next time. Stay curious, stay engaged, and let's keep building a stronger, smarter energy future.